As we were preparing for today, Traci and I were having just some conversations and realized that we have so much to catch up on. And so I feel like this hour is going to go by extremely fast. And so I want to go ahead and get us started. And so I'll take a moment just to provide some high level information about why we do this podcast, what it's all about, and what you have to look forward to. So my name is Dr. Nika White. I serve as the principal lead consultant of Nika White Consulting. We're based in Greenville, South Carolina, and we serve clients all over the country, helping them to integrate into their business framework, strategic diversity, intentional inclusion, and a lens of equity. And so today you are joining us for Intentional Conversations. Again, it's our podcast where we help center voices among those that join this community to be a part of our discussions related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I am joined here today in the backstage by my colleagues who are assisting with the technical aspects of today's podcast. And so I just want to take a moment to acknowledge them. Thank you, Natasha Poritskova, who is serving as our DEI manager and the producer of Intentional Conversations, as well as Elvia Pacheco Flores, another DEI manager. And then our newest add to the NWC team is Lauren DeKay. Welcome, Lauren. We're so glad that you're here. She is serving as a DEI manager along with the team as well. And so go to the next slide for me, please, Natasha. I want to go ahead and let you know that we took a break last week for Thanksgiving. Hopefully, while it may have looked a little different, it was restful and it was a great time with your family, no matter how intimate it may have been. But we also are going to be away next Friday. We will be closing the office, not because we won't be working, but because we're going to be doing our virtual all-day retreat to allow us to just come together, do some strategic planning, and get prepared for the new year. So we look forward to seeing you, though, the next week. And I will go ahead and let you know that we have a phenomenal co-host that is joining us for December 18th. And it is Karen Catlin. I'm not sure how many of you know her. You may have known at least the name, but she has a book entitled Better Allies, and it's all about everyday actions to create inclusive and engaging workplaces. So I cannot wait to join forces with Karen and to share with this community. Next slide, please, Natasha. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my guest co-host for today, Traci Newkirk. She's not only a friend, but she is also, we were just talking, she is one of my partners in terms of helping me to be thoughtful from a business perspective. I've called on her numerous times, and I just appreciate all that she brings to the business sector, as well as just to the community of women and her support of seeing others thrive. And so I want to give her a formal introduction, then I'm going to allow her to come forth and just greet this audience in her own way. So Traci Newkirk, for 18 years, Traci has worked beside her husband as they have grown their staffing, software, and consulting practice. ICAP has won fastest growing business in South Carolina for the last 6 years through a lot of blood, sweat, and perseverance. Through the joys and challenges of building a business, Traci's real passion is developing people, driving engagement, and building a positive culture. And so as we engage with Traci today, I want you to show her some love into the chat, just with the welcome. Thank her for being here and accepting the invite. And Traci, share with us your story and greet this audience in your own way.
Well, hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I might have had feedback. Oh, perfect. Well, hello, everyone.
Perfect.
Greetings from Greenville, South Carolina. So excited to be on here today with my friend and just fellow brainstormer, Nika. It's always great to brainstorm together about how we can handle issues in the workforce, and I really appreciate that. My husband and I have been married 30 years, and we've owned a business for 17 of those years. Wow. And
wow.
Owning a business has been great, but don't ask us to be tennis partners because we will certainly fail at that.
Well, great. Well, Traci, we appreciate you being here. And I always like to make sure that I give our guest co-hosts an opportunity to share some personal information that people can't just find, of course, in their bio. I always like to make sure that I give the accolades and the credentials, but tell us what we will not find in your bio that help us to have a better connection to who you are and what you appreciate about life and the work that you're connected to.
Sure. I guess one thing that I want you to know is that I want to live a life of intention. And I understand that while I'm not in my last chapter, I am in the second part of my book of life. And so I live with the philosophy of yes. And my philosophy of yes is I want to try, whether it's friends, my husband, my kids, whatever, I want to try to give my best yes and give a yes to everything that I do. So that means that I'm intentionally full, but I've chosen to give yeses whenever I can. So that's something that you probably wouldn't see. And probably the other item about myself I'd like for you to know is that I've been on a quest to be emotionally healthy, and what that looks like, and how I lead with empathy. My number one strength is empathy. And so I want to make sure that in all things that I am careful with the story that I've told myself, and that I'm leading with a positive intent about myself as well as others. So that's probably 2 things or 3 things that you wouldn't know by just looking at my LinkedIn.
No, I love that, Traci. And the fact that you mentioned you have a huge focus on being emotionally healthy. I think that's a message that resonates with many of us, especially as we find ourselves in a climate where we're dealing with so much, including the global pandemic. And this has been a really hard election year, and there's still a lot of anxiety that's associated with that to come. And then, of course, this has been just a hard year in terms of the pronounced severity of systemic racial inequities that exist across so many systems without exception. And so I look forward to engaging deeper today on some tips that I'm sure you're going to be able to share with us about how we can be emotionally healthy and why even emotions are important. So let's kind of start there. I know that you've spent a lot of time studying different emotions and how in which those emotions and being personally aware of how in which we're showing up in those emotions can help us in our interactions with others and just leadership in general. So give us a little bit about that.
Well, I guess I want to start out with a story, and that is about a month ago, I was called into an organization to help coach an employee, a manager, who for all intents and purposes was a high performer, excellent at her job, but she would not be promoted anymore because of her outburst, of her emotional way, unhealthy way of dealing with conflict, of the way that she interacted with her teammates that she managed, interacted up with the people who managed her. And I'm passionate about that because I feel like for her, her emotions were really inhibiting her growth and her potential. She had great potential, but what she hadn't worked on was the potential to regulate, self-correct herself when it came to her emotions. And so there was a lid, there was a ceiling on her growth and her potential of who she could be.
So what do you say, Traci, to individuals who really have strong convictions about trying to manage your emotions in a way where you really kind of diminish them, especially like in a work or professional environment?
Well, and I understand that my statement could be controversial, and I'm okay with that. I do not feel like, yes, I feel like that we should be careful as women to show up and not bring our full selves to work. Everybody doesn't need all of us all of the time. And for instance, and I use a language called StrengthFinders. It's a assessment. But I will say your strengths are often like a gas grill. They shouldn't be on high all the time. So I might go to a meeting from 8 to 9 and I might need certain talents and the other talents need to be turned down. And then I might go to another meeting from 11 to 12 and I need to turn up other things about myself and turn down some other talents. So being aware of self-aware first, and then learning to self-regulate, and then also learning to express myself third. I think the mistake that we're making is we're expressing ourselves before we're self-aware and self-regulated. And so I'm actually a proponent of switching the paradigm and first being self-aware and then learning to regulate and then express. So that's why I said I don't often feel like we should bring our full selves to work.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and it's certainly a perspective that I'm sure many in the this community are really wanting to dig a little bit deeper into. You referenced StrengthFinders. I'm going to ask my colleague to get a poll up at some point soon because I'm interested to know how many in this community are familiar with StrengthFinders, which is through Gallup, and you actually introduced it to me. And we've done it as a family. The four of us have done it as a family. And then we've done it with organizations I've been a part of. And I am such a big fan. It's one of the things that every single one of the candidates that we may entertain joining NWC will take as well. And so it's just a great tool. So give us a little bit more about StrengthFinders for the context of this community.
Sure. First, I guess I'd like everybody to know that there are about 272 personality assessments, and they're all great engines in some way. They can all help you. But what I have found is that I can use strengths to grow people, to help them leverage themselves better, because it's the how. It's how you get things done. It is about performance. And so using that in the workforce has been very efficient for me. I also like Enneagram too. That's another engine. Enneagram is about the why. It's about your motivations. It's about your childhood trauma. And so I merge those two together to help people become more self-aware. Because one test is easy to go, oh, that test is no good. But when it's 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and they're saying the same thing, at the end of the day, you're resigned to, okay, this is my God-given talent. This is who I've been created to be. So StrengthFinders is just positive psychology, and it was formed in 1950, and there is a science behind it. It is a 140 question test that you take. The first is the purest, and it's about the intensity of your natural talents that have been around since you were 5 years old.
Yeah, it's such a great tool. I absolutely love it. And the poll is live for those of you who want to let us know if you've ever taken it and you're familiar with StrengthFinders. Please go over to the polls tab. We have a few so far. And those who have responded, 100%, they are familiar with StrengthFinders. So I'm so glad to hear that. So you mentioned a moment ago, Traci, the importance of self-awareness, right? And that is kind of a prerequisite before you can begin to self-regulate. And I totally understand that. I even talk about it in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that work begins at the personal level. And so I want to just talk about what are those steps to become aware of again, your emotions and how you show up, and so that you can use that information to inform ways that you can help regulate.
Well, I guess the first thing that I want to say is that emotions are God-given to tell us that something is wrong. Mm-hmm. Something could be right also, right? There are emotions that are right as well, but it's also telling us something is wrong. And so oftentimes people will put emotions into this negative box of don't bring your emotions to work, or don't show up and tell me how you feel. And I can talk more about that in just a second. But there are 8 primary emotions, and these emotions are good. They're like an organ. I mean, when your organ, say when your spleen is sick, it doesn't mean that the spleen is bad. It just means that it's sick. Emotions are the same way. Emotions are good, and they are a sign that there's something that we need to be aware of, or something that we need to regulate about ourselves or ask a question about. I think feelings are different in that feelings can get us into trouble. Feelings cause us to act. And there is action in feelings, and oftentimes not a self-awareness around those feelings.
I love the fact that you provided some distinction between feelings and emotions. I don't think I've ever really reflected that there were a difference there. There is a difference there. So I appreciate that. So let's talk about it. What are those 8 emotions that you just referenced? Can you give us a little bit of overview?
I can. There are 8 primary emotions that I want you to be aware of. And I believe that we have a slide, and I'd love to go to the slide where it breaks them down as good and bad, because I think this is interesting. And I'm hoping this will be something that you guys will enjoy and can take with you. So
Fantastic.
We'll go to the next one. Next slide. There we go. So, there is a book, by the way, that I highly recommend called The Voice of the Heart, and it helps us to be aware that emotions are a gift or an impairment. And I love the thought of that. For instance, let's talk about lonely, which is something I felt during COVID. I mean, I felt great loneliness, but is it loneliness from people or loneliness from being heard? See, there's ways that we can dive in and be more specific about lonely. But loneliness is a gift in that it can tell us that we are lacking intimacy with someone. But it can also be an impairment if it leads to apathy, if it leads us to going, forget it, I don't want to be around anybody, or I can't be around anybody. Just like sadness is a gift because perhaps it might help us to accept something, but it can also be an impairment if it causes self-pity. So I guess the big thing about this slide is, and I hope that people can screenshot this and enjoy this, is that emotions are both good and bad. They shouldn't be seen as always bad. And perhaps there are times that we need to evaluate that it's like like a beeper in the hospital going off, going, something is good or something is going on with us that we need to check out further.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. I just realized you didn't hear my question.
I was trying to do this.
I know, and I was realizing that, okay, she can't hear me. Yes, I want you to talk about how these emotions really drive our actions and really the implications of that, because I think that goes back to that self-awareness piece.
Yeah, exactly. So, first of all, there are 8 primary emotions. They're a gift. They're good. Now, there are 436 feelings. Our feelings are on the next chart, and I want to talk about feelings now. 436 feelings. Now, feelings will drive actions. And I think actions, when they're used irresponsibly, can get us in trouble in the workforce. So as you can see by that slide, there are light, medium, and strong, right? These emotional feelings, the emotions there are at the top, and those are all the feelings below. Now, I've printed it out because my eyes are not good, but let me go to one, for instance. Let me talk about the word nervous. Now, nervous is under fear, right? And we've all said, if emotions are a gift and they're good, and I'm nervous, is that bad? Or is it something for me to be tentative about? And I think that's where it's great for us to process, because sometimes fear can be seen as a good thing if it keeps us from making a mistake. But sometimes it can be seen as a bad thing if fear keeps us from making a decision and we take 8 months to decide something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I guess I'm trying to break our feelings and emotions down and become more self-aware about, okay, are you fearful or are you nervous? Because those are 2 different words. And then you can say, well, what am I nervous about? And is this nervousness good or bad for me? Before we let the nervousness cause us to react.
So what are some of those other feel words that, as we are engaging with people and we really want to make sure that we're standing in solidarity, we can support where they are in that moment, that we should be aware of? And if you're referencing the chart, it could be because it's really small, but definitely point out some of those words so that, the audience, if they can't see it, they're having challenges seeing it, they know what you're referring to.
So I want to talk about shame a little bit, because shame is a feeling. It's not an emotion. It is a byproduct of emotion, but it's not an emotion. Or blame is a feeling, but it's not an emotion, right? And so those words are coming under some other big words up there. Let's go back to the story that I told in the very beginning. When I'm working with this employee now, and I'm just I try to ask a lot of questions. So tell me how you're feeling. I'm feeling angry. What are you feeling angry about? I don't know. Well, here's a sheet on feelings. Can you look down at the anger column and can you circle all the items that you're feeling? She's like, I don't relate to any of those. And so then I said, okay, let's look at all the feelings. And now I want you to circle those. Guess what? She was feeling fear. She started circling all these other words that were coming out as anger, but actually it was fear that she was feeling. And when we were able to pinpoint that, then I could begin to ask other questions like, so tell me, why are you feeling tense? Well, I'm feeling tense because I feel this pressure to produce. So is the pressure to produce something you're putting on yourself, or what management is putting on you? And she goes, it's something I'm putting on myself. I said, okay, so if it's something you're putting on yourself, let's go back to your strengths now and look at what strength is turned up too high and causing you to overcompensate, overtake maybe some rationale about yourself. So is it your responsibility who's feeling like I've got to have everything perfect and everything's got to be done and I've got to perform, I've got to check every single box? And she goes, yes. And I said, have you asked your manager about your performance? She goes, oh, he tells me I do a great job. And I said, then if he's the one that's giving you the promotion, doesn't his opinion of you matter? So in a probably just to try to a quick way, it's important to understand the way feelings are driving our actions. And we spend a lot of time on people's behavior in the workforce, but we don't backtrack enough to say, what are your feelings and how can you regulate your own feelings? Because regulating their feelings will help their behavior to change.
No, that's good. I want to clarify something. Kathy Moore has a question into the chat, or really wanting to get some clarification. You mentioned that shame is a feeling and not an emotion, but I think that part of the primary emotions that were listed in the slide indicated shame as an emotion. Can you clarify that?
I definitely misspoke there, because on some of my feelings charts, remorse is used instead of shame. Right. But so I would agree with Kathy. That probably was confusing on my part. So I apologize.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, shame is difficult for me. Just me personally. I'm an Enneagram 2. So it's a struggle for me. And so I've been doing a lot of work to understand even shame. And I'm not sure I'm probably educated enough to speak on that. But I can understand remorse maybe a little bit better.
Yeah, well, I'm surprised. Well, not surprised. I'm glad that shame happens to be one of the emotions that is coming out of this discussion, because when we relate this to diversity, equity, and inclusion, part of the message that I always like to articulate to groups is that shaming, guilting, and blaming is counterproductive. Don't do it. And so I just want to get your thoughts on that to relate to the perspective you're taking around, again, just being emotionally healthy and being self-aware to know where we are. Are we dealing with feelings or emotions?
Great question. Could we go to our next slide? And the next slide should be the story that we tell ourselves. Perfect. So Nika, for me, we see and hear, we tell ourselves a story, we feel, and then we act, right? So I've been primarily this first part dealing with feelings right there in that second from the right. But I actually believe that shame lies in the story that we tell ourselves. At least for me, this is what I'm discovering. And I think that there are three stories that we tell ourselves. 1, we're the victim. 2, we're the villain. Or 3, we're helpless and we can do nothing about it. And I feel like that shame comes in either the victim or the villain. And sometimes blame comes in during the villain story, which is, I can treat you poorly. I can blame you because you're the cause of my problems. Does that make sense?
It does.
And yet, again, I go back to, we have to be self-aware and take responsibility for our own feelings and emotions without blaming other people and using a villain story in ourselves. Well, you deserve for me to treat you this way, so I'm going to blame you, instead of saying, you know what, my bad, or let me think about this, or let me analyze how I'm feeling, or let me dig into why I'm even blaming you in the first place.
Right. No, that's really good. So we talked about shame. I also want to now deal a little bit with fear, which of course you've already introduced, because it is really big. And I feel like it's pronounced right now for many reasons, of course, dealing with what's going on from the societal perspective. But fear diminishes candor. And I think that that creates challenges as well, especially as we're trying to normalize people being willing to engage in difficult and hard conversations. And so, what would be any suggestions or advice that you would give to individuals that are allowing fear to keep them from having healthy banter and conversations that can be very fruitful for outcomes that can yield success?
There is a contrasting statement that has helped me personally whenever I felt fearful.
Mm-hmm.
And that contrasting statement starts with what I don't want and what I do want.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like when I'm fearful, can start a statement by saying, what I don't want is for me to come across in a way that it hurts our relationship. But what I do want is to speak honestly and vulnerably about something that I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you notice that I said think in that last sentence rather than feel, because I do want to address something is that we as women, if we're not careful, if we constantly use the words I feel, there are people who immediately shut off and do not consider our information as data.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would rather us as women use words like I think or I have thought about rather than I feel.
Yeah. So Traci, full transparency, and I always like to make sure we have healthy dialogue in these conversations and really appreciate the perspective you're bringing. I would imagine that there may be some women among this community or just in general that have heard you talk about this before that may hear those words and they become very frustrated by the fact that they have been told for so long, don't bring your feelings into the workplace. And then now it's a shift of your feelings are valued and it's a part of the nurturing aspect that we bring to an environment. And so how do you help people to reconcile these different perspectives?
I don't think it's easy.
It's not.
So let me be transparent. I'm 53 years old. And so I'm from a different generation. And because I lead with empathy, I use the word I feel in my career for probably the first 40 years, or I didn't work for 40 years. So let's say the first 20 years. Mm-hmm. And I would see something happen. And it's not just a gender issue. It's an issue with the word analytical. People with an analytical nature, as soon as I use the word I feel, they tend to cut me off. And so it was a personal quest for me to be heard. And if I had to change my words in order to be heard, I was willing to do that. And again, it could be just my generation and forcing my way up and through. I work in an IT sector, so I work with a lot of analytical people, both men and women. Mm-hmm. And so when I just changed, instead of saying I feel, I said I think. It didn't cause them to be defensive to what I had to say.
Yeah. That's interesting. I'm going to have to try that and just, observe and see if if I'm seeing a different response and action, because I'm really curious about that. And I appreciate you bringing it to this conversation. So before we continue on, I want to help connect the dots to this conversation of being emotionally healthy and being self-aware and understanding all of these emotions and how in which they can drive our actions to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So can you touch on that for a moment, please?
I will. I again go back to I cannot be an inclusive manager or a business owner, and I'll just speak for me personally, until I become healthy in my self-awareness and healthy in my self-regulation. Mm-hmm. I cannot appreciate where anyone is coming from unless I understand that I come from a different place. And it causes me and has caused me to be more curious about others.
I love that.
And to be inclusive. And I really believe in that value. To be inclusive, I must first start with me, and then I must work on us. And part of working on us is to say, hey, this is my story. What's your story? Tell me how you're feeling about this. Tell me how you see. I'm trying to, in all things, show up and not be offended, but instead be curious.
I love that. There's a lot of value in authentic curiosity because it gets us to a place to where we are willing to learn and to self-educate. And through that initiative, I think that it certainly opens up an abundance of opportunities for us to become more proximate to the lived experiences and issues of others who are different from us. And then that deepens our understanding and our ability to find ways in which we may be called to action to help create greater, better, prosperous outcomes. And so I love the connectivity of this emotional healthy state, allowing us to be open. We often hear people say we can't, pour from an empty cup. So it's about making sure our cup is filled so that we then can be able to be of service, to others. And when you were talking earlier, what came to mind for me was this notion of we have to assume positive intent, because it is hard. It's easy for our thoughts and what we may say and our actions to be misinterpreted. And for someone that really is following a journey of authentic curiosity, they're going to have to be willing to make mistakes. And then the others who are in their circle are going to have to be willing to extend that grace and accept that grace and assume positive intent. Because I think that sometimes that is part of the issue as well, is that we input meaning into people's actions, which automatically causes us to disengage. And that compromises our healthy state of being.
Yeah, and that's the screen in front of us. Here, we tell ourselves a story in 1 second. And that story that we've told ourselves is filled with all the past interactions with that person. Then we feel a feeling and then we act. And then there's either, we're either happy that we acted well, or we're either embarrassed that we acted poorly. So I feel like it's stopping with the telling ourselves a story sometime. And I think the other thing, Nika, I just got out of Thanksgiving. And so my prayer that I woke up Thanksgiving morning was, I said, Lord, help me to not be offended today. Number one. 2, help me to forgive before anything happens. Wow. My family isn't perfect. And we have our share of challenges, right? And our Thanksgiving was lovely. Mine was. I can only speak for that. But I felt like I started the day saying, help me to not be offended and help me to forgive before something even happens that day. And
I love that.
Is in a way I was trying to change the story that I was telling myself, that I was going to walk with intention through the day, and that's how I was going to see the day.
I love that. And I'm a woman of faith, you're a woman of faith. And I certainly realize that not everybody in this community, faith is something that's really important to them. But regardless, I think that it's important to acknowledge that the sentiments behind help me to forgive, having this mindset of forgiveness, even before something happens, is a good leadership practice. It's a good practice for being able to build healthy relationships, period. Because again, it goes back to, it puts us in this posture of, I'm going to assume positive intent. And I think that's just so critically important for environments. And so I'm so glad you brought that up. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge the live Facebook audience that we have that's watching and joining us today for today's Intentional Conversation VodCast. And as you have questions, please place them into the chat. We do have teammates that are bringing those questions into this environment, and we will be sure to address them. And some of you have already presented some questions, and so we're going to make sure we get to those momentarily. So keep those questions coming. So aside from emotion, Traci, what are the 4 other parts that are driving how in which we communicate? Or is that part of this mastering the story?
I think part of mastering the story is understanding first, what do I want for myself? What do I want for myself in this conversation that I'm having? Mm-hmm. And second, what do I want for the other person? And I think and the third would be, how would I act if I wanted those things?
Right.
And that's that part of mastering our stories, mastering it so that our stories are not controlling us and leading us to some of those, 400 feelings that we talked about before. And that's from a book called Crucial Conversations that I have a certification in. And it's really been very helpful because when I do the pre-work before I sit down, I feel like for me, conversations have been more, not positive, but more productive. Mm-hmm. They're not always positive. There's some tough things that we have to discuss as owners, as managers, just as people, family members. But when I can do the pre-work before I get there, I seem to be better in control of my feelings. I seem to be telling my feelings how to feel instead of reacting from those feelings.
Yeah, no, that's good. Crucial Conversations is a phenomenal text. And I know that there are also, you mentioned that you are licensed and facilitating those courses, but there's sessions, learning and development opportunities associated with it as well. And so if it's not already up, I'm sure my team is sourcing that to place it into the chat as a resource. So I want to I'm thinking through some of the comments that are coming forth so far. I want us to take a moment to acknowledge some of that. So when you were talking about bringing your whole self to work, and you said not everybody needs all of us at all the time, I can appreciate that. But I will say that I'm also one of those DEI practitioners that I communicate often the need for people to be able to bring their whole selves to environments and to not have to feel that they need to cover or mask portions of their identity, because then that creates challenges for them that I think is to the detriment of their healthy well-being. And so it's about finding that right balance. But what Frank says is it's unfortunate, but it is true for us all. Bringing your whole self can be met with limitations of your workforce permissions, respect, and their traditional limitations. They aren't ready. So my question is, they aren't ready, but someone's going to have to compromise and someone's going to have to sacrifice. And I find that most often, though, it's the individuals that are sacrificing. And when I consider that if you cannot show up at your best because you're questioning whether or not you belong or whether or not you're accepted, that prevents the organization from optimizing on reaching its best. And so it's not easy. And I appreciate the perspective and just want to have a little bit of additional banter around that.
Sure. So let me go back to StrengthFinders a little bit because I think it's a common language that helps people.
Yes, the balcony and the basement, which I love that about StrengthFinders language. Yes.
Yes. So someone with high analytical, for instance, when we're talking about bringing our whole selves to work, right? They might think that they bring all of their analytical to every single meeting. And someone high in analytical loves to ask questions. It's how they gain information, right? But they'll ask 10, 20, 30 questions in a 30-minute to an hour meeting. You tell me if that's helpful. It's not helpful. It's not helpful to them. It's not helpful to the meeting, right? And so what I try to do is say, what are 3 to 5 questions that you can ask in that hour time frame to get enough information and then go privately and ask more questions. So that's what I mean about not showing up and being your whole self all of the time, because it is regulation. And it's really about learning what is enough. How much of yourself is enough before it leans to causing you a weakness, causing you a lack of disrespect. So that's just one way.
No, that's very helpful. And I love the connection point to the analytical strength that many people do have. And certainly helps me. I think that maybe the difference here is, oftentimes when we talk about it from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective, it is about portions that we can't change. I can't change that I'm a Black woman. I can't change that I'm a female showing up in this environment. But yes, strategically, how in which we identify our strengths and our weaknesses, that's all about, again, that balcony and that basement and managing that. So I appreciate that additional commentary. So let me see what, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to say one other thing.
Yeah.
I think there are also ways that we can be aware about how we show up. And I think the self-awareness helps us in inclusion as well, including others. I think there are 4 things. Environment, understanding that we all came from a different environment. The second, generation. We all came from a different generation. So my way of speaking and a millennial's way of speaking might look a little bit different. It's not bad or good, either one. It's just different. So how can I be curious? A third is family of origin. Some people come from the family that's called the no talk rule, right? Don't back talk an elder, right? Other people come from this very vivacious, everything is an argument, but they all leave loving each other. So the family of origin affects that. And then the last, of course, is the culture. And we could talk about, like you said, me being a white woman, you being a Black woman, what does it look like for our culture and how that we show up? I think if I'm aware that everyone is driven by those 4 factors, again, self-awareness, I can give you the space and permission to show up because I understand that your culture is different from mine, and I can be curious and be interested and not be offended.
Oh, absolutely. And not be offended. Yeah. And I think that's an important distinction as it relates just to understanding diversity in general. It's not about right, wrong, good or bad. inferior, superior. It is just different, And I think that the reason we can easily become offended is because we begin to classify it, different dimensions of diversity as right, wrong, good, or bad. And so I appreciate that. So here is a question from Sophie. I love the open-minded yes philosophy. However, I'm wondering how you draw boundaries in order to not become a yes woman where people take advantage of you because they know you live by this philosophy. Yeah, that's a great question, Sophie.
Yes, great question. It's one sentence. What am I responsible for and what am I concerned about?
That's good.
That's how I figure it out, right? So, I am responsible for me. I am not responsible for anyone else, but I am responsible for me. So I think responsibility for concern, I can be concerned about you, and that's where I need to be careful in my yes, right? Because not everything needs my involvement in.
Right. We may not be the vessels that necessarily will reach whatever that end goal is for, maybe we're just ones who are planting seeds. But I like the fact that you mentioned responsible. What am I responsible for and what do I care about is a way to help reflect on, should I answer B, yes or no? I like that.
And many times the answer, unfortunately, has to be no, but it doesn't mean that it can't be yes later. Maybe it's no right now, or maybe it's no, but I have a better person for you, or maybe it's no because I'm not the best suited for what you're asking me to do, or maybe it's no because I won't be able to pay attention. And I'd like to give you my full attention. And so what's another time that we could look at our schedule, right? Or maybe it's no because you're unhealthy and it's not a good time. I'm not healthy enough to be around your unhealthiness.
And you're practicing self-care.
I'm not able to say right now.
Right. Or Traci, maybe it's no because you realize that saying no allows you to be committed to that other yes, which is more priority. So I love this conversation because I know that it's a challenge for a lot of people, particularly women, but a lot of people to really be able to create those boundaries, especially when it relates to saying yes and no to different opportunities that we care about and we think that are worthwhile, but we may not have the bandwidth and the emotional capital to be able to get to it. So I really appreciate that.
I also had a friend time. She said, I know you desire to say yes to me, so I want to give you the permission to say no if this doesn't work.
Oh, I love that. I wish more people would approach me with that.
So I also think then it becomes about a reputation that you're not just no all the time, that your people closest to you realize that you're going to do your best to work it out. And I actually have to shout out to my husband. When we married 30 years ago, he said, I want to say yes to most things. And I'm going to ask you to join me in that. So that actually was not my nature to begin with. I grew up in a household of no. And so learning what it was like by watching him say yes. And the yes sometimes wasn't yes, but not now. Or yes, that's a great idea, but let me think on it. Right. It was, again, he would say, the kids would go, Daddy, I want some candy. He'd say, yes, that's a great idea, but not before dinner.
I like that.
So it was lovely. And I have to give him a shout out because he helped me with that.
Yes. Shout out to Barry. Good job, Barry. We love it. You're teaching us here. You're not even here. That is awesome. Okay. So I want to go to some of the other questions because we have a number of them. So this is from Ishwar, and I may not be pronouncing that correctly, so forgive me if so. But the question is, in the DEI field, how do you address similar feelings from different people being received differently based on the ethnicity of the person, as well as the gender and age? Gosh, that's a great question.
Great question. And I will go back to StrengthFinders again because it's genderless, ageless, raceless, right?
That's true.
It is a language that I can use with people that will cause you not to be offended or to think positively about someone else. So that's why I use that. Honestly, I have to be honest. I'm not hired in that space. When I am hired, I call Nika. I have to be honest. However, I feel like it gives us a common language that we can begin to look in a positive light at someone and understand, hey, this is how they just show up. It's not that they're trying to be annoying to me. It's not that they're showing up and being annoying. This is just how they show up. These are their talents. This is what their talents need. This is my talents. This is what they need. So might not be the answer that he was looking for. I apologize. But for me, that's how I've used is a common language that supersedes most isms.
Well, so I love your response, Traci. I think that is spot on. What I would add to it is I think that we have to be comfortable as individuals being able to respectfully say, I don't see myself in that statement, or to say that hasn't been my experience, but this is my experience, and to just stand in that truth and not let someone else diminish that truth for you just simply because it's not their experience. Where we sit determines what we see, and that lens is really going to guide our actions. But we cannot dismiss the experiences of others just because that has not been something that has affected us. And so it is a great question. I appreciate you bringing that to the fore. So Frank's question is it an American thing to be robotic in the workplace? What are your thoughts on that? Are we robots in the workplace, Traci?
I'm too passionate to be a robot.
I'm with you. Yeah. I think that for many people, yes, that is their reality. They feel like they have to fit into a box and to conform to mainstream and to do what's expected, which means to me, I think that it certainly compromises an inclusive environment because people are not being themselves. They are, just conforming to whatever the mainstream dominant norms and culture may be. And I think that certainly hurts the organization's ability to fully leverage diversity, equity, and inclusion as an opportunity.
Sure. And I will say too, I find that people allow other people to tell them who to be too easily.
Right.
It goes back to self-awareness a little bit. And so, for instance, I was coaching a gentleman the other day who's been laid off, I don't know, 3 or 4 times. And when we started really digging into who he is, what his motivations are, what his values are, what his talents are, he was clueless. For 55 years, he had let someone else tell him who to be and who to become. It went from his mother to his wife to his employer. And all of a sudden, he's showing up at 55, constantly being let go for jobs and completely unaware of really who he is, what he likes. So it's not, I don't feel like it's just a gender issue. It's really across the board where we're not taking control and being developmental with our own selves and seeking to grow and discover who we are, what we like.
Yeah, that's true. But it's unfortunate still nonetheless. And for me, I feel like oftentimes it's because individuals do not sense that they have a high level of psychological safety in those environments, which is why I wanted us to get to some point where we had some clarity around, okay, it is necessary at times to be able to, from a healthy perspective, show up as your full self. But then, yeah, from a strategy perspective, how are we now navigating that to where it's comfortable for us? But yeah, that's hard. Did you want to comment, Traci?
I do. I want to also, and Nika, I'm passionate about this. I think it's really important for us to understand our values, right? Begin with the end in mind. So what do you want said about you when you die?
Yeah.
What does that look like for you? And then set intentions about that in your life so that you can be purposeful in how you're showing up, right? So for me, I want to be loved by those people I love. So I want to make time for those people. And so I'm going to say no to other things to make time for those people. And I'm not going to care about how that looks for me. But in other areas, right, for my business, which I shared with you earlier, I'm real particular about my brand and how I'm training and the quality of the training and what it looks like in the preparation. And that's because of an end value that I have and that I want to help grow other people.
Absolutely. No, I get it. It's a great contribution to this discussion. Yeah. And it goes back to, we have to be self-reflective, take the time to realize what it is that we want. And one of the things that you do so well, because I've been one of the beneficiaries with an organization that I'm closely connected with, is helping people to not only identify what those core values are, but also take it a step further and identify what are those values violators. Because again, we have to be very explicit. We can't just assume that when we communicate that this is our value, everybody's going to know how to deliver upon that exactly. So I always find it helpful to be able to, on the same token, communicate the values violators. And you do that so well. So I want to go to another question, and this is from Rose, and Rose is joining us today from Brazil. Thank you so much, Rose. And here's her statement or question. I have a doubt. May I say, in my opinion, instead of I think? The question makes sense, at least for me, because it's the way I usually communicate my ideas. So I think it was just going back to you saying the difference between, as females, our statements being I feel versus shifting to I think. And so appreciate Rose's comment there. Do you want to say something about that?
No, I'm in agreement with her, and it's a everyday occurrence that I challenge myself to say I think. It's been a paradigm shift for me. So let's just talk about feelings, right? Go back to that. Feelings are a data point, right? They're one point of data. And so by challenging myself to say, I think, I am putting my feelings as one point of data, but then I'm allowing myself to find other points of data to surround my feelings with as well. Is that helpful? So for me, and I can't speak for Rose, but for me, I used to think my feelings was the only data point. And it really is not. As I've grown and matured and tried to become emotionally healthy, I've realized that sometimes my gut is correct, and then other times it has not been correct. So for me, I had to say, I am not always correct in my feelings. You know, the science says that feelings are plastic and that memories are not accurate. That is painful for me. That is painful. And so with that data, with that information, then I have to start filtering my feelings through and saying, are they plastic? Are they accurate? Are my memories accurate? And if they're not, let me find some other data to put and associate with these feelings to make sure that I have expanded this pool of meaning and that I'm walking in with a well thought out approach.
Yeah. No, that's good, Traci. This is so rich. I was quickly looking to see if my husband had joined or not before sharing this. But Rose, I can certainly understand how, in my opinion, really works well for you, because I've noticed that my husband of late, he has been very deliberate about when he's giving his thoughts to me to share in my opinion. And I think that that's also his way of prefacing, you can't argue with my opinion, and maybe right or wrong, but still I'm entitled to my opinion. And so maybe that's part of what allows people to engage. You really can't argue with someone's opinion. And, you know, you may perceive it to be right or wrong, but still they're entitled to their own reflection. So.
The other statement I think that's helpful is to say, here is my story.
Yes. Here's my story. I like that. That's another good way.
Here's my story, right? And so I've often said to my husband, I've said, hey, here's my story about the way I just interpreted your actions. And he goes, oh, wow, I did not mean that. Let me tell you my story and what my day has been like. And so that has been very disarming. And I find that when I use, here's my story, he's not defensive versus maybe some other ways that I've communicated in the past.
I like that. Here's my story. Here's my experience. Yeah. Or here's what I think I'm hearing. No, those are really good suggestions for us to all try out. Okay. So we have a few more minutes. I want to try to get as many questions in as possible. When it comes to self-awareness, is there a need to qualify religion when it comes to inclusion? Christianity specifically can lead to some feeling excluded. What are your thoughts on that?
100%. And I do think that's where, when I can say, here's my story and here's my experience and here's my culture and the background that I grew up in. Tell me about yours.
Yes, no, that's good. Yeah, I didn't use the words, here's my story earlier, but when we were acknowledging that, you know, faith is really important to me, faith is really important to you, I wanted to make sure that I was inclusive of this full community by saying, relating that to something that was not necessarily specific to the Christianity aspect of it. So
I think
thank you.
I will say, Nika, I think we've got to get better as Christians to make sure we're staying curious and make sure
Yes.
that we are, we're saying this is our story, but I'd love to hear yours. I'd love to hear your experiences.
Yeah.
I'd love to understand them better. Will you tell me where you came from?
I appreciate that, because I often do feel as though many people will perceive that if I interject my story and my opinion, if others don't have that same experience, it's going to leave them out, but it prevents them from sharing their story. And I don't think that that's really the goal that we're after. We have to be willing to hear people's story, even if it's something that maybe we don't identify with, and not get offended by that,
Mm-hmm.
Because there's some people who could be a part of conversations today. Maybe they could be thinking, well, there's nothing absolutely wrong with acknowledging that, faith is important to you, or that you are a Christian. That is your story.
Mm-hmm.
And your story is okay for your story. And so anyway, I'm glad that you brought that up.
I guess it's close it's being intentional about getting close to perspective.
Yes. Yeah.
And
I
understand that I have a certain perspective, but I'm curious about your perspective as well. And I can also understand that your perspective comes through several different lenses. And your theories and my theories, while they might be different, there's something to learn from every person that we meet.
Absolutely.
Something maybe it's like, hey, I don't want to be that way, right? But there's still something to be learned.
Oh, absolutely. That authentic curiosity that we've been talking about this hour is so incredibly important. So, well, we're getting close to the top of the hour. So I want to thank you for sharing so much of yourself, your wisdom with us. And I know that I'm going to walk away with a couple things I'm going to start putting into practice and being very observant about to see the reaction. And so I appreciate that. So I always like to have my guest co-host to end with sharing with us anything that we have not talked about that you are feeling very empowered by these days, or you're really been drawn to, that you would like for us to know, Traci. Is there anything I haven't asked you that you want to share?
Well, I guess it's the holiday season. It's been a tough year for many of us. And I guess, oh goodness, there's so many things, but I will say one is to think about if your dialogue and your conversation is about war or about peace. And I've been using that a lot, and that's been really helping me to be more thoughtful in my communication with people, especially people who are different than me. Right. And then I also would say that all people want one thing in conflict, and that's for it to end. But yet at the same time, the parties involved in the conflict want the other party to change.
Oh, that's good.
So sometimes it's just about working on ourselves and not expecting change from someone else. And those are two things that I'm just sharing that I've been really focused on in the last month.
That is so good. So good. And such a tremendous way to end our time together today for the Intentional Conversations podcast. Traci, I always feel seen, valued, and heard when people accept my invite. And so first and foremost, thank you. Thank you for being such a friend and a thought partner to me. And then, just your passion for this work and wanting people to be at their best. I see it in all that you do, and I'm so grateful for it. I also want to thank this community for joining us today. You could have spent this hour doing other things, but we really do appreciate that you found it fit to connect with this community. We hope to see you again, not next week, because remember, we're going to be on break while my team takes our annual retreat. So we'll be virtual, but yet and still it's going to refresh us to be able to come back and to continue to offer valuable opportunities like intentional conversations. And so thank you all. Enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you on December 18th for our next intentional conversations.
Thank you,
Bye.
Nika.
Thank you.
Bye.